The time has finally come to take a look at the one game many of you have been longing me to cover, the terribly overlooked and to some underrated Spider-Man Web of Shadows. Released a year after Spider-Man 3 in October of 2008, Shabba Games was brought in after being recently acquired by Activision to develop a Spider-Man game as Treyarch was becoming more and more detached from the webhead, following suit with Spider-Man 3, and was now focusing their efforts on the big old blockbuster known as Call of Duty World at War. However, they ended up assisting Shabba Games on this title, which is kind of crazy when you really look at all the other stuff they had on their plate at that time. But it makes sense, given the fact that creating a brand new engine with a recently acquired developer with less than a year's worth of time on top of creating new assets and all the trials and tribulations that come with game development, this was probably the only way this game was ever going to get done to meet the strict Activision quota, as Treyarch knew the engine and Shabba Games really did not. And there was no point in scrapping that engine as it was a pretty good foundation to build upon with enough time. Plus, it probably would have cost more to start from scratch, and again, there was no time whatsoever for that, so here we are. Be that as it may, this is the last time folks from Treyarch would have any association with Spider-Man ever again, and by that extension, the folks at Shabba Games as well, as Activision pulled the plug on the studio not long after the release of this game, which is tragic really, given the hindsight of the quality of games we would get after this one. After this, Beenox would become the sole dev in charge of Spider-Man games for the rest of the Activision license cycle. So, the Treyarch, thank you. You incredibly gifted people helped define my childhood in more ways than one with your games, and I cherish those memories dearly. Game development is oftentimes a very thankless job, with a lot of developers usually receiving the ire of the gamer for reasons that are sometimes unjust, and are most likely due to the publisher, but that's a whole nother can of worms that we'll get into at another time. Regardless, there are a lot of hardworking people working to ensure that some child could have the same memories that I did growing up that I had with Treyarch and Spider-Man. So to everybody at Treyarch, if you ever watch these videos, just know, I appreciate the hell out of each and every single one of you, and I wish you all nothing but the best in whatever endeavors you may have in your future. Now with all that being said, let's get on with this review, shall we? Talking about Web of Shadows is an immense challenge, and I always knew it would be, even from the start of me doing these reviews. In a lot of ways, much like Spider-Man himself in this game is a story of multiple sides: the good, the bad, and the ugly. And while I overall enjoyed my time revisiting Web of Shadows, I cannot deny the game is absolutely marred with issues from top to bottom, but there are also things in this game that are absolutely fantastic, and therein lies the issue with the game. I'm torn because at its core, Web of Shadows is probably one of the best Spider-Man games to ever come out. But because of the issues suffered and some of the decisions made, it drags this game down to a point where you cannot in good faith say that without being called a liar, and there being multiple reasons justifying that claim. That's the short and skinny of it, but we tend to go more in depth here, so strap on in, this might take a while. As per usual, we're starting off with the plot. The story in this game is actually really great.
If you're on drugs...
Jesus shocking Christ, this game's plot is absolutely bonkers in every conceivable way, and if you're the type of person who likes an over-the-top, non-stop, balls-to-the-wall kind of story, Web of Shadows has you covered in spades. We start off with Spider-Man slowly walking off a rooftop, serenaded by Moonlight Sonata, all the while a symbiote invasion is happening.
Symbiote invasion? There are more of them?
Apparently so, Reno, man. Thank you for the cameo, by the way. We should get together, man. It's been a little while. No? Okay.
Shield guys getting mauled by what looks like vulture-type symbiotes, and is that Mary Jane holding a shotgun? Oh yeah, we're only just getting started here, folks, but be warned, I am going to skip around a bit and just do a general plot summary as opposed to my usual deep dive, because Web of Shadows is the type of game whose entire plot can be explained in one go. Most of you know this, but for the few who don't, we'll circle back around to that in a second. This section of the game is meant to be something more of a prelude, whetting the appetite of what's to come in the coming hours of the game, as at this point Spider-Man has a plethora of moves at his disposal, which leads to the system shock of the next part, which is how the entirety of the mess this game has to deal with starts with you being stripped of all the cool things you were able to do just previously. Venom and Spider-Man get into a scuffle and Mary Jane gets her in the process. In the ensuing fight, part of the Venom symbiote detaches from Brock and reforms with Spider-Man, giving him all the strength and poor decisions the suit comes with, while allegedly being more in control this time around. You can also seemingly take the suit off or on at will. After beaming Brock with a few beamers, Venom darts off. Spider-Man now shifts his focus on Mary Jane and getting her to the nearest hospital. After doing so, suddenly gang war. After dealing with that, suddenly Luke Cage. Seeing the sudden gang war, Spider-Man decides to team with Cage to bring an end to it, hoping to bridge the Rolling Sevens and the Park Avenuers together in a parlay. And here is where covering the game's story gets really difficult. Suddenly a bunch of weird Iron Man knockoffs, actually, sorry, I'll take that back, Crimson Dynamo knockoffs with guns start getting into position to snipe the two leaders of the gangs, who are attempting to parlay, and once the snipers are disposed of, you are given a choice as things start to break down between the two gang leaders in negotiations. You could either tell them the truth and let them know that they were being played and were set up and be a hero, causing the two gangs to form an alliance, or you can let the gang war continue to ravage the streets and wipe out the gangs, which Luke Cage gets extraordinarily pissed about because you knew about the setup and did nothing to improve the situation. There are a lot of situations like this in this game where you have to make a choice between doing the bad thing and the good thing, and depending on choices made in the game will result in different scenarios playing out or even different endings taking place, which makes covering the plot, as said earlier, really difficult without just generalizing what happens. This makes Spider-Man Web of Shadows by default one of the longest Spider-Man games ever, as multiple playthroughs are needed in order to really see everything the game has to offer narratively, on both sides and in between. After coming to the conclusion that the high-tech goons set to kill the gang members are working for Fisk, Spider-Man heads out to Fisk Tower to confront the big man himself when suddenly, Black Cat. Okay. She's working for Fisk and attempts a robbery when suddenly Moon Knight. Okay, this game is just throwing characters at the screen right now. And look, I'm not going to complain about Moon Knight being in a game because Mark Spector is a freaking badass, and I kind of wish he got more representation in any medium, to be honest. Anyway, you catch up and confront Black Cat, who admits she's not really working with the Kingpin and is doing all this crazy for Spider-Man, who admits love for him, and yet another choice to be made here, either denying Cat and her advances and working with Moon Knight to take down Fisk, or embracing her love and cheating on Mary Jane and rolling with Felicia to take down Fisk. Regardless, you attempt to start screwing with Kingpin's operations when you encounter Vulture, who's responsible for the Goblin gliders that are roaming around the city the Kingpin's goons are using. You take him out and he presumably gets arrested, or not really, because it's not too far off from now where you see him out and about like the previous encounter never happened. And look, there are a lot of inconsistencies throughout the game like this sort of stuff, so we'll be here all day trying to cover it, so just take my word. Anyway, you go on the hunt for more Kingpin goons when you're suddenly attacked by a bunch of deranged civilians with Spider-Man just seemingly chucking them off a rooftop. The cops and a couple of news crews see this and label Spider-Man as a murderer, and you now have pretty much everyone questioning your motives and if you're to be trusted. As you're searching for clues as to what's going on with the civilians, suddenly Wolverine. My god. He's the only other hero that knows to some extent what's really going on, as he can sense symbiotes harvesting themselves within regular civilians with his animal keen senses. And he also senses the one on Spider-Man, prompting a fight to test his allegiance. Regardless of the outcome of you either proving yourself or continuing to fight Logan, the two of you team up to sniff out symbiotes hiding within human hosts. Right up until you encounter Venom, who is literally dragging humans off the streets to infect them and put them in symbiote pods. Venom gets away, and then it starts getting bad. Fast. The SHIELD comes in and quarantines Manhattan, as what started as another day of Spider-Manning quickly turned into a nigh-apocalyptic symbiote invasion, with both villains and heroes getting affected, and it's up to you on how to devise how to stop it and try to bring everything back to normal. You might be thinking, wow, you kind of didn't really talk about the other end of the game there. And yeah, I didn't, because while Web of Shadows is completely insane in its plot, it's probably one of the most entertaining ones simply because of how absolutely batshit insane it is. It's not a good story, and barely cohesive at that, but because of the red or black meter and the choices you make throughout the game that impact your morality meter and story beats, there are things in this game that spoiling it for the uninitiated would be an injustice to those who haven't experienced it, and might want to. It's like bad horror movie levels of what the fuck. Think Troll 2 or The Room, but it's Spider-Man. That's kind of the plot in this game. With 4 different endings and a ton of choices to be made, this game's replayability factor is at an all-time high. My main problem, besides the other things I've mentioned already, is that certain choices hold more weight to the story than others do. For instance, there's a part where you fight a symbiote-enhanced Electro. Upon beating him, you can either encourage him to fight off the suit, or you can quite literally beat the suit right off of him, while berating him the entire time. Regardless of your choice, it doesn't really impact the story in any way and is more for the red and black meter. It's kind of just filler. Meanwhile, there's another character who gets infected later on in the game in which if you make a certain choice will change the ending dramatically no matter which allegiance you fall on during the end of the game. This kind of stings, as anyone who's blindly playing through this game will never really know which choices have the biggest impact on the story, without replaying, which I guess falls under that double-edged sword of replayability. I have other issues with the story as well, but that falls more on the gameplay side of things. which we'll talk about later. Tonally, it's all over the place, as there are some genuinely dark moments in this game, with this very clearly inspired Dark Knight moment with a symbiote-infected vulture and the shield goon, even if they completely forgot to modify his voice to sound more symbiote-like, which they did in its boss fight, so oops.
This one's no longer useful. Good day.
But it completely crashes and burns in an instant once you hear the nails on a chalkboard voice that is Spider-Man. Holy conchu, does this guy's voice get grating on the nerves. It's not to say that his performance was bad by any stretch of the imagination, because it's not. He does his job and conveys the emotions he needs to. It's just his voice is not something I'd want to listen to for an entire game. It's like listening to Pee Wee Herman talk to me about crack, but for 15 hours. A nasally sounding Spider-Man is not something I think anyone really envisioned the character sounding like. Maybe Peter Parker pre-Spider-Bite, but definitely not Spider-Man. I'm sorry, Mike Vaughn. It's not you, it's me. Okay, maybe it is you, but I appreciate your effort nonetheless. I will say though, despite this preference I have with this voice actor in particular being Spider-Man, some of the character banter in this game is actually really hilarious. Take this instance with Wolverine and Spider-Man, for example, where he just roasts Wolverine for apparently having a MySpace page.
Oh my god, you have a MySpace page, don't you? Dork.
I do not.
Ah, you totally do.
Shut up, kid.
Will you add me as a friend? I'll poke you, you poke me back.
I said shut up!
The rest of the cast is serviceable. Nothing truly stands out as a breakthrough performance in this game, but I will say it's awkward going back to the pre-performance capture days, as there is a clear disconnect between the direction the actors were given and what the writing, artists, and animation teams intended for the scene to be. There are snippets like this in the game where it tries to convey a sense of urgency, but the audio just does not match up at all. The strides in technology. Speaking of strides in technology, this New York City is insane. While its graphical fidelity took a hit from the photorealistic approach Spider-Man 3 went for, it opted for a more comic book-inspired design mixed in with some photorealism. It looks great with some pretty awesome details here and there, and an actually colorful Times Square which is just littered with Easter eggs all over the place. It's so good I'm willing to forgive the fact that it holds two Daily Bugles within earshot of each other. It also holds an insane amount of detail for a game of this generation. And what I mean by that isn't so much the city itself, even though if you look around there's plenty of evidence to that, but rather how the city reacts to you. Almost everything on the ground level is destructible, from storefronts to walls and fences to bus stops and even air circulators on roofs, to cars that actually react to what's happening to them during the in-game scuffles you have. This is all an insane leap from Spider-Man 3, which again was almost a year earlier, that most open-world games even today still don't have. You also can't forget the fact that there are two versions of this city, one that's completely normal, and another one that's ravaged by the symbiote invasion. And that's only scratching the surface on the overall flexing Shabba Games and Treyarch did on the technological front. Spider-Man in this game, as mentioned earlier, can at will change from the classic red and blue to the Symbiote Suit, and it is not in any way, shape, or form just a palette swap, which one could argue for Spider-Man 3. Oh, and can I just say that I actually love the way Spider-Man looks in this game? Barring the eyes, which is honestly just a nitpick for me, as I like bigger eyes on my Spider-Mans personally, the colors and the overall look of both suits are just so rich and vibrant. I just sometimes sit there without moving and pan the camera around to just look at the character model because it's really that good, even for a game that's nearing 2 generations ago. Anyway, moving on. There are fundamental shifts on the gameplay front that happen when you do swap suits, and the fact that it's so easily accessible within a single button press is actually insane. We'll cover that in a bit more detail later on when we talk about gameplay, but I cannot stress enough that this, for the time period that it was in, was nuts. And it's kind of near criminal how little talked about this is. It's one of the most innovative things I've ever seen in a superhero game, but because Web of Shadows had the unfortunate luck of following Spider-Man 3, most elected not to pay attention to this game because Spider-Man 3 kind of sucked, and this wasn't Spider-Man 4, so who cares, right? It's not only just the gameplay shifts that it presents either. The background music and the overall sound effects change instantly to reflect the shift the black suit brings, and even civilians themselves will have a negative reaction if they witness Spider-Man transform in front of them. All of these details are amazing, and it wasn't something that I was honestly expecting from this game, and it shows that both Shabba and Treyarch were working really hard to deliver on this game. I just wish that some of that detail shined through on the narrative front. And since we talked about the city, it's only natural to talk about how you move throughout the city. So how does Web of Shadows fare in comparison to the other Spider-Man games in regards to mobility? Sweet Christmas, is the mobility in this game amazing. I am not exaggerating when I say that Web of Shadows has the best mobility in any Spider-Man game post-Spider-Man 2. Web swinging, wall crawling, wall slides, web zipping, pole vaults. It's so good! Web swinging in this game is tight and responsive, and it actually has momentum-based pendulum physics. We can even do loops. Oh, I miss doing loops so much. When properly leveled up, you become a red and blue bullet speeding down the streets of Manhattan. You level up your health meter and swing speeds by collecting spider emblems and sets, which give you levels of speed upon full set completion, littered throughout the city, capping out at level 11. You move so fast, in fact, that the game cannot keep up to your movement speeds, at times stopping you in midair in order to continue streaming, or loading for those unaware of the terminology, the rest of the city. Yeah, this is a bad thing, but the fact of the matter is, the speed of which you're moving throughout the city is insane. I wish we could even move a fraction as fast as we could in this game in Spider-Man games today. Unfortunately, though, it's not all roses. Another slight on the web swinging, besides the fact that the game literally cannot keep up with it, is the fact that web lines do not attach to buildings at all. That's right, you're more often than not swinging on a cloud. Now, while you usually won't be swinging above any buildings like the Amazing Spider-Man 1, barring a few missions that require it, web lines are tied to the city grid, but not specifically buildings. Think Amazing Spider-Man 2, but vastly better, like by a mile. While this is a big issue for some, and for me personally it bums me out a bit, I cannot stress enough that the mobility in this game is top-notch, and if cloud swinging was needed to accomplish this, I'll take the slight compromise. But the real make or break for this game is how all of these mechanics blend in on each other. As seen in the Amazing Spider-Man 2 and even Spider-Man 3 to a certain extent, how these mechanics work together in tandem is how much fun you'll have doing it, as making these things work seamlessly is more important than just having them. And it all works so beautifully in this game. None of the Spider-Man 3 bullshit where animations stunt your momentum drastically, or the Amazing Spider-Man 2's wonkiness. Everything is fluid and designed to work with one another, complementing one another on how you want to go about traversing the city. L1 and R1 are mapped to wall running and wall crawling respectively, and at any point in time can be initiated while near a wall, or in the case of wall running, coming off an edge of a building or even going up one. Web zips also work by tapping the swing button as opposed to holding down, and depending on if you're in the air or on the ground will work differently, as zips on the ground propel you upward, while being in the air is grounds for the more traditional forward pull. Also, it's nice to see where Beanox got some influences from, as the upward zip animation that was pretty heavily featured in all of their games is almost a direct copy from this game. Wall slides are one of the most satisfying things to do in this game, as it tends to retain your speed, whereas the wall running will at times stunt your momentum a little bit. There's nothing quite like propelling super high up in the air after a web swing and aligning yourself up with the side of a building and watching the wall slide go to work. It is so much fun. It's super satisfying. You can also do wall slides going up a building, easily executed by doing a web zip while sliding, but I'm not quite sure gravity works that way. And like I said, it all works well with one another. Even the camera doesn't have as hard of a time than some of the more recent Spider-Man games to come out after this, keeping track of the movements because it's so far back it allows you to see everything. And for the most part, it's pretty good about responding itself to Spider-Man's current location so you don't get lost in what it is you are doing. Unfortunately, however, it's not all peaches and rainbows when it comes to the mobility, because while everything works well, the unfortunate part is that the frame rate issues that permeated throughout Spider-Man 3 return here. The good thing is, however, is that they are not nearly as bad as they were in Spider-Man 3. I mean, just compare swinging in Central Park and Web of Shadows versus in Spider-Man 3. But it does make it somewhat difficult and straining on the eyes at times when the frame rate tends to go suboptimal, and once again, you have the ability to move so fast that the game literally stops you in place in order to keep up. When you're moving fast and fluidly, one of the last things you want to do is to be stopped forcefully or otherwise due to game mechanics or issues. And sometimes the game forces you to do so, and it really sucks. Ideally, 8 levels of swing speed might have been okay here, as having 11, while appreciated, is way beyond the realm of what the game can properly handle. I'll tell you what though, I do long for the day where we can get a swing speed in a Spider-Man game that comes anywhere close to this game. That'll be wild. And now, we talk about the gameplay. Oh boy, do we have a lot to cover here. The gameplay is, screw it. The gameplay in this game is shocking amazing. It is without a doubt one of the best in any Spider-Man game ever, specifically the combat, which helps elevate this game in all the most substantial of ways. Whew. Now that I've got that out of my system, let's tackle this in a more nuanced way, shall we? Combat in this game was the first to really dive deep into the nimbleness and the acrobatics Spider-Man has always been known for in the comics. The games prior to this one and even some after have always focused on Spider-Man going toe-to-toe with his enemies, and while that's certainly something the character is capable of, the fact of the matter is that Spider-Man's strongest asset, outside of his humor, is how he combines his speed and his agility to overwhelm his opponents as opposed to sheer brute force. We've seen this done in the comics a billion times throughout various splash panels over the years, often showcasing silhouettes of where Spider-Man is going and what he's doing, taking out multiple goons in one go. This is done expertly in this game with the addition of the web strike, which allows Spider-Man to quickly hone in on an enemy when with enough upgrades either launch him, paddleball him, or kick flip, or do some damn loops on a fool, or just simply throw him like a sack of potatoes. All of these moves are as satisfying to pull off as they are to look at, and seamlessly going from one enemy to another and styling and profiling while in the air is a genuine joy very few games can give me. The buck doesn't stop there. Air combat is also a thing in this game as well as fighting on the ground, and good lord is it satisfying. The game returns to what worked best, opting a return to form using Spider-Man 2's one-button attack system with a dedicated webbing button and a button dedicated to web strikes. While you can probably get by simply mashing the attack button, it's a lot more involved than that, as timing out your attacks properly can initiate different properties, or even holding down the button after certain attacks will change the attack completely, and more often than not, offer a more powerful alternative than just simply button mashing. You can tell the teams took a hard look at Spider-Man 3 and actively took steps to correct and in some cases even apologize for the colossal mistakes that game made. In fact, I've been waiting to say this for a while, but the entire game in certain respects feels like one big apology for Spider-Man 3. From its mobility being a lot more tighter to the combat being a lot more responsive and fluid, as opposed to the heavily oppressive nature of committing to animations in Spider-Man 3, to even something like QuickTime events, which return in this game and admittedly caught me off guard since I didn't quite remember them as much as I used to for Spider-Man 3. Sorry, Black Cat, you might have to stretch after that landing. Oof. To things like super moves, which weren't a terrible concept being brought back from Spider-Man 3, with a much more polished outcome and, quite frankly, more interesting moves, giving you some insanely satisfying super attacks that all work and all have purpose, with its own dedicated meter, meaning that you can strategically use supers for bosses and crowd control and not have to worry about a constant cooldown like you would have in Spider-Man 3, unless you spam finishers or use the meter for its other feature, calling in allies. This is a pretty awesome feature, but admittedly it's my least used feature in combat because depending on the AI in this game can be a toss-up really. But the visual of seeing Wolverine or Moon Knight or even Black Cat or Electro, depending on your allegiance amongst other heroes and villains laying down the smackdown along Spider-Man, is pretty awesome, not gonna lie. But that's only half the combat options. As mentioned earlier, the Symbiote Suit comes with a host of different properties, from being able to throw cars to just basically becoming an insane powerhouse, using tendrils from the suit to just wipe out every and anything in front of you. And I mean, look at this. You literally skateboard on your enemies in this game, which is just clearly Shadow Games having all of the fun with this combat system, and a clear homage to their past works. I see you, Grind Session, I appreciate you. Which might explain why they got so many things right that are momentum-based, but that's another discussion for another time. Few things give me as much joy as the power fantasy the black suit gives you in this game. Everything is great. Comparing this to Spider-Man 3 where the black suit in that game was essentially a palette swap with one good move is crazy. It's clear that there was a lot more effort put in this time around to differentiate between the two suits. Again, this seems to be another apology for Spider-Man 3. There is so much depth to this combat system that it is virtually impossible to cover it all without gushing at it. But it doesn't stop there. Wall combat is also another feature that gets its own time to shine here, with a host of upgrades dedicated to it, and it's some of the most insane and fun things you can do in this game, with both suits, not just tailored to one. With all I've mentioned so far, and the abilities both suits bring, plus the fact that you can freely swap between the Symbiote Suit and the classic suit in an instant with that same translation pulling through on the combat move front, the combat capabilities are literally endless on what it is you can combine together and do. Unfortunately, it's not without its issues. While Web of Shadow's strongest suit is undoubtedly its gameplay, you get an overwhelming sense that the devs themselves knew this and designed everything around it. Mission structure because of this suffers the heaviest. If you came into Web of Shadows expecting a lot of mission variety, you are sadly mistaken. A lot of what it is you are doing throughout the game is heavily repeated from beginning to end, with some optional side quests even having this same issue. It's usually take out a random number of enemies or defense missions where you have to protect a certain object, or building from danger. It gets extremely old, fast, and at a certain point feels lazy, especially since you kind of have to do some of these side quests in tandem to the ones forced on you in order to progress the story, in order to earn experience points to further unlock combat options if you want to max out everything you can, which I would highly recommend you doing so because a fully maxed out Spider-Man is an absolute blast to play. But the process of getting to that point? Not so much. This could have been alleviated by having more things to do in the open world outside of the same old missions for the various characters throughout the game. Things Spider-Man games of the past have had, challenge modes, races, things of that nature to help sprucing up a game that is heavily leaning on its very good gameplay to keep players engaged, without completely burning them out on it by the upteenth hour with its repetitive mission structure. Why not lean into the cameos a little more and tailor side quests that make sense within the characters that are tasking them? Certain side quests as well can just be grating on the nerves. For instance, there's one side mission in particular where you have to attempt to separate the symbiote from the host a certain number of times, or collect samples from new symbiote types that appear further into the story you get into the game, but there's never a clear explanation as to how you separate the host or even collect samples from within the game, leading to a lot of frustration for some, whom the only way to figure this out is to look at an old GameFAQ article from years ago. There's a lot of things in this game that are like this. For example, the web climb mechanic from Ultimate Spider-Man, which I thought was the only game to feature said mechanic, was also brought back in this game. But I had no idea about it until it was mentioned in that Ultimate Spider-Man review that it was even a mechanic in this game, because 1, there's really no need for it ever, as you can gain your verticality pretty easy from just releasing from your web lines properly, and 2, the game never even bothered to tell me it existed at all. Or how about the fact that the longer you stay in the black suit, the more it hurts your alignment meter? While that might seem like common sense to those of us who have played Web of Shadows before, to those who haven't and find themselves enjoying the black suit gameplay more than the classic suit, it might be a bit of a system shock to those who have been playing the game and don't realize that the bottom right icon above your health meter isn't changing from classic to symbiote simply because you choose to be in one suit over the other, but rather that being in the black suit for extended periods of time, by default, makes you a bad guy even if you're choosing good choices throughout the story. Furthermore, and say it with me now, webbing is kind of not absolutely useless in this game. Don't get me wrong, its usefulness in this game is minuscule, because webbing at its best is a great defensive tactic to incapacitate enemies temporarily, but the problem is that the game doesn't reward that at all, and it's about the only thing you can do besides the web strike. It emphasizes more on straight-up action and aggression than any defensive play, and even in moments where defensive play could be a thing, or should be a thing, you usually can counter the enemy's counter, promoting more aggression and less passivity. And unless you're running into fights and taking a bunch of damage, which you really should never be doing because the challenge in this game isn't exactly great, defensive play is never necessary. The Symbiote Suit does not have this issue at all, as webbing-based attacks are strictly on the classic Spider-Man side of things, and Black Suit Spidey ends up getting a brutal as all hell throw, which just, oh, it's so good. Web throws or hammers from Spider-Man 2 would have been an amazing addition, especially during the invasion, as enemies do tend to absolutely swarm you, and if not for the super attacks and some of the Symbiote Suit tendril attacks, you can get absolutely mauled if you're not paying attention. I feel like these web attacks are kinda useless as well. I mean, visually it's cool to see Spider-Man unleash a barrage of webbing on someone, but there's never an enemy in the game that requires this much webbing. Speaking of defensive options, you don't have a dodge button in this game. You do, however, have a block button, so I guess that's better than nothing.
Oh, really?
And Spider Sense does tend to alert you of danger sometimes, even though it shouldn't be working on the symbiotes, because they're technically invisible to the Spider Sense, but narrative sacrifice for the gameplay, so I'll take it, I guess. Moving on. And once again, the frame rate is a big issue, more so here than in the swinging. While the frame rate during the swinging sections were manageable, they are not even close in combat. Half the time the game tries doing way more than it's capable of, and it suffers heavily for it, with a lot of enemies, a lot of explosions, a lot of destructibles in the environment. I've had the game's frames drop into the single digits at times just due to the sheer amount of stuff happening on the screen at any given time. I'll give the game this. It's ambitious as all hell for what it's attempting to do, but if your game plays like this, it's not a good look, fam. Not at all. I'm not even sure if this is a PS3 exclusive problem as well, but man, it can absolutely be rough at times. In fact, it's actually frozen my console a handful of times during the recording. A few more months of optimization could have prevented this, but I feel like that wasn't really an option given Activision's strict release deadlines, and it definitely shows throughout the course of the game, as the game is littered with bugs. From AI scripting issues to enemies just being trapped behind buildings, civilians who go from falling to just casually walking away. I mean, there's no denying it. This game is an absolute mess at times, and no matter how good things are on the gameplay front, it's not enough to sweep the many glaring issues this game has under the rug. But perhaps the biggest sin that Web of Shadows commits is the endgame. This is an open-world Spider-Man game, with one of the most satisfying combat systems and mobility systems the character has ever seen, of which you spend hours upon hours upgrading, doing the same repetitive missions, same repetitive side quests to max out your Spider-Man. My main save file has thousands of spider emblems collected with the max swing and health upgrades. I prepped myself to go into the endgame fully prepared to just go throughout New York City and just occasionally beat up some Kingpin goons. Or swing around and just chill. Except you can't. Why? Because this game committed the biggest cardinal sin in an open world gaming. Once you beat the game is over. After the credits roll, you go back to the main menu. All those upgrades you spent time on? Gone. An entire city to fully explore? Gone. If you try loading up your autosave, it kicks you back to the credits. There is no open world to go back to once the game is over, making the journey of everything you did and everything you unlocked worthless. There's not even a New Game Plus, so any attempt to replay this game with all your stuff is impossible, and I would have rather had that than having to start from scratch all over again if there was no endgame open world to swing around in. This is absolutely bonkers, and it still racks my mind to this day as to why this decision was made. Did they just not have enough time? I need answers. Why? Why?
What was the reason? What was the reason, bitch?
If the reasoning behind it is because of the different endings, there's a simple solution to this. You have two Manhattans in this game. One is ravaged by the symbiote invasion, the other is totally fine. Depending on which choices you make results in which factions go after you, or you can go after. It doesn't seem that hard. There are solutions to this problem, and the fact that the teams just seem to omit this for reasons that are still unclear to this day really bothers the hell out of me. And it wouldn't chap my ass so much if it wasn't for the fact that the game is a blast to play on the gameplay front. I don't want to stop playing Web of Shadows. I'd love to continue playing this game casually after it's over, but I can't. It's because of all of this that Web of Shadows, despite having some of the best mobility and combat mechanics the character has ever seen, gets weighed down massively in my eyes. I much prefer this game over Spider-Man 3, as like I said, a lot of the games seem to be an apology for that game, with mechanics that are just amazingly polished in comparison to that game. But the technical issues, the lack of any real mission variety, and an open world that just seemingly goes to waste with nothing more to do than just crimes and tokens to collect, which don't matter in the end anyways, as you have to do it all over in a new game, anchors this game massively. And while it doesn't quite sink the ship, it's just barely above water. And much like how I felt about the game, typing the following sentences out is equally as bittersweet. 7 years ago, I made a promise to myself to review all the major release Spider-Man games, and this was the last one I had to do. Not even realizing until a couple years ago that I was one of the OG Spider-Man content creators, and to just see where I was then and where it's all led to now, well, it's kind of nuts actually, even if everyone else has passed me by. It's been quite a journey meeting a lot of you on the way, and while my plans may have not gone the way I wanted it to, I stuck to my goals, and I'm happy to have met them, even if it did take me a hell of a long time, which, I'm sorry guys. I appreciate the hell out of each and every one of you who have stuck by me on this journey, and apologize for taking a long time. I guess it's kind of my thing. Where we go from here is anyone's guess, but I hope you guys stick around for the ride, wherever that may lead us. Until the next time, take care everybody.